Okay, I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Peter Pryor. Dr. Peter Pryor is the Executive Director for the Task Force on the Study of Electronic Magnetic Pulse Weaponry by the Homeland Security. He has been doing this for many, many years. He is the national expert on this, and he is here tonight to give you the facts and the information you need to walk out of here with so you can speak intelligently about it, be motivated to sign the petition, and more importantly, to be able to share this information so when we go forward to the state, we can do that. So I'm happy to be able to have Dr. Peter Pryor with us tonight, if you're ready to, our guest speaker. All right, it's all yours, Dr. Pryor.
Well, I've been introduced, I think. So, thank you for having me here tonight. Can you bring up my first view graph? I'm going to do this briefing the way we used to do briefings when I worked at the CIA. Electromagnetic pulse, or EMP. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but professionally, I've spent my whole professional life working on weapons of mass destruction, trying to prepare the country for nuclear, chemical, and biological war. First at the CIA, then for the U.S. Congress and the House Armed Services Committee, then on a variety of congressional commissions, including the Congressional EMP Commission, which has been recently reestablished by Congress. And I've again been appointed the Executive Director of the Congressional EMP Commission, while I continue to be the head of the EMP Task Force on National and Homeland Security, which is a congressional advisory group. And the reason I have been focusing on EMP now, although I have known about and studied other weapons of mass destruction all my professional life, is that EMP is the threat that worries me the most, because it poses the greatest single threat to Western civilization, and yet it is the least understood. It is the greatest threat because of its catastrophic consequences. It can be caused by nature, by man. It can be caused by man quite easily. Yet we are defenseless against it. However, there's no reason for us to be defenseless against this threat. We can and know how to protect against it. It wouldn't be that costly. But the politics of EMP and the incompetence in Washington have prevented our country from taking steps to protect itself, which is why I'm here today talking to you in Texas. I've been encouraging the individual states to take steps to protect themselves against it. And this has been done so far in the states of Maine, Virginia, Florida, and Arizona. They all have passed legislation, taken steps in the direction of protecting their peoples and their electric grids from the catastrophic consequences of an EMP attack, or naturally the event from the sun. And Texas, led by Senator Bob Hall and Governor Abbott, is a major state that has been moving in the direction of protecting itself. And it is my hope that if Texas does the right thing and protects its electric grid, it'll break the log jam in Washington so the whole country can be protected. Let's go to the first view graph. The next view graph, please. Let's talk about the sources of the EMP threat. What is EMP? First, let's talk about the one that's easiest to understand, the threat from the sun. And many people consider this to be the worst because it is inevitable. It is certain to happen. What you see here is an actual photograph. It's not an artist's depiction. It's an actual photograph of a solar flare, technically speaking, a coronal mass ejection coming out of the sun. And what a coronal mass ejection is it's a huge blob of ionized plasma, basically a hunk of the sun, that gets thrown out of a sunspot like an electronic cannon and hurls out into space. The little blue dot that you see, which is inset on the screen, is for scale. It's not the actual orbit of the Earth. Earth, but it gives you a sense of the size of one of these big coronal mass ejections, Carrington class, so-called because this is the kind of solar flare or coronal mass ejection we're most worried about, which could cause a once in a 100-year geomagnetic superstorm, such as happened in 1859, which we call the Carrington event. And what you see here is the kind of coronal mass ejection that caused the 1859 Carrington event. And see how much larger it is than the Earth, many times larger than the Earth. And these coronal mass ejections travel about 1 million miles an hour. In the case of a Carrington class one, it travels faster than that, 3 million miles an hour. And it'll come slamming into the Earth. And the only thing that saves us from being burned to a crisp is the magnetosphere. It's a magnetic field that surrounds the Earth. But in the process of saving us, the magnetosphere gets distorted, wobbles around. And this is what generates a natural electromagnetic pulse in the form of a geomagnetic superstorm. Geomagnetic storms happen all the time, every year. And usually they only affect countries at high northern latitudes like Russia, Sweden, and Finland. Every now and again you'll get a normal geomagnetic storm, a normal storm. It'll come at a lower altitude. Like in 1989, the Hydro-Quebec storm blacked out half of Canada for 9 hours. Killed a few people probably and caused billions of dollars worth of damage, but it wasn't catastrophic. It wasn't a civilization-ending scenario, which is what we're worried about. In 1859, when the Carrington event happened, this was the most powerful geomagnetic storm on record. It was a worldwide phenomenon. The solar storm was so powerful that you could read newspapers by the light of the Aurora Borealis in London. And the Aurora Borealis showed up on the Hawaiian Islands. Back in those days, it was the horse and buggy days, and civilization was not yet dependent upon electronics. But early electronics were present. Telegraphs and telegraph stations had been deployed in every continent by the British, French, and German and colonial empires, India, Africa, China. The United States had just laid a transatlantic cable for telegraph across the Atlantic Ocean. And in 1859, when this happened, all over the world, telegraph stations were destroyed and disrupted. Telegraph stations burst into flame. The electronic keys, the telegraph keys, which were very robust pieces of electronics compared to our modern semiconductors, were big hunks of metal, were actually melted. Telegraph wires burst into flames and caused forest fires all over the world. The pulse was so powerful that it reached miles deep down into the Atlantic Ocean and destroyed the transatlantic cable that had just been laid. Great Eastern had to go back across the Atlantic Ocean and lay the cable again. Now this was an inconvenience for civilization in 1859. What we are concerned about is the occurrence of such a geomagnetic superstorm in the modern era, when we are now an electronic civilization, and we cannot survive without electricity. The National Academy of Sciences estimated that if a storm like the 1921 railroad storm, the geomagnetic storm that happened in 1921, which was only 1/10 as powerful as the Carrington event, that if that happened today, it could take 4 to 10 years to recover the electric grids, which is the same thing as saying that we would never recover the electric grids. Because the Congressional EMP Commission, of which I served, estimated that if we had a nationwide blackout that lasted just 1 year, up to 90% of the American population would perish from starvation, disease, and societal collapse. And also from unprecedented environmental catastrophes that would result from an electric grid. A protracted blackout, you have to understand, that would result from a geomagnetic superstorm, or from other EMP events that can be made by man. It's not just an inconvenience where the lights go out for a long period of time. When the electricity and the electric grid collapses for a protracted period, actually all kinds of disasters happen. For example, we have over 100 nuclear reactors in this country. They only have emergency power for 7 days when the big grid goes down. After 7 days, just like in Fukushima, Japan, reactors melt down. The fuel rods and the cooling ponds will catch on fire. overheat. You'll end up with steam explosions, radioactive steam explosions, cooling ponds of the reactors, which would cause vast radioactive plumes that would cover the most populous half of the United States, because the nuclear reactors are co-located with our populations, centers for the most part. Other kinds of disasters that would happen, would be the, when you lose electricity, the gasoline stations don't work. So eventually, you'd only be able to drive, have transportation for a period of time that you still have gas in your car. So very quickly, the transportation networks would be paralyzed. So there would be no way of getting food delivered to grocery stores. Natural gas pipelines, would explode because the SCADA systems would spark, be overloaded. You could end up with firestorms in cities. Most industrial complexes, like oil refinery plants or giant chemistry sets, just waiting for a spark to set them off, those would explode. Rivers and lakes would become polluted from backflows, from plants that purify our water. We'd have backflows of hospital wastes, human wastes, industrial wastes back into the rivers and lakes, which even in their normal states are not safe to drink from. You would take your life in your hands if you went out and tried to drink lake water or water from a river and hope that you wouldn't get sick. Well, in the aftermath of an EMP, those bodies of water would be very severely polluted. And so these reasons, but mainly because of the lack of food and water, when the electricity goes down immediately, there's no running water, no pure water. Starvation and lack of water would end up killing most of the American people. We only have a 30-day food supply in the country for 320 million people. So how do you keep 320 million people alive when there's only a 30-day food supply and the blackout lasts a year? That's the deadly arithmetic. So this is one threat, one of the big threats that we're most worried about. Geomagnetic superstorm like the 1859 Carrington event. We estimate that these happen once a century. 1859 was more than a century ago. We were narrowly missed by Carrington-class superstorm back on July 23rd, 2012. Crossed the path of the Earth by just 3 days. You see these coronal mass ejections come out of the sun all the time, so we're basically in a game of Russian roulette with the Earth. And it will happen. It's not if, it's when. NASA estimates that the likelihood of a geomagnetic superstorm is about 12% per decade. That guarantees that within our lifetimes or that our children, we will probably experience a geomagnetic superstorm, Carrington event. It will put at risk the lives of billions. We need to be prepared, but we're not prepared. Washington is so broken. It's known about this ever since the EMP Commission warned about it back in 2008. And for 8 years, they've done nothing. But there's no reason for doing nothing. The states can protect themselves and protect their people. It's called islanding the grid. It was one of the recommendations of the EMP Commission. You can put in Faraday cages, blocking devices, surge arresters, known for 50 years how to protect against nuclear EMP, which is even worse than natural EMP from the sun. So you can protect the Texas grid, even if the rest of the country goes down. The people of Texas would have the lights on and surround. Let's go to the next people. Next, please. Let's talk about the nuclear EMP threat. You can create something like it, a natural geomagnetic superstorm, by detonating a nuclear weapon high in the atmosphere in outer space, so it disrupts the magnetosphere. And you don't require a high-yield nuclear weapon. That's one of the myths, that you need a sophisticated hydrogen bomb. High yield to create a deadly EMP. That is not true. Any nuclear weapon could pose potentially an EMP catastrophe to this nation. Even a crude first-generation nuclear weapon, like a Hiroshima or Nagasaki bomb, it wouldn't generate EMP fields as powerful as, let's say, a 1 megaton or 20 megaton weapon, but they would be powerful enough to collapse the electric grid, which is always operating on the threshold of failure and has never been hardened against EMP effects. Another aspect of the myth people should understand, is actually the biggest nuclear EMP threat is not from high-yield weapons, but from a weapon of very low yield. It's called a super EMP bomb. It's a nuclear warhead that's specially designed to generate EMP. Instead of putting out a big explosion, it generates gamma rays. And it's the gamma rays that cause the deadly aspect, the most threatening aspect of the nuclear EMP. It's called E1 EMP. It's a very short wavelength phenomenon, much shorter wavelength than natural EMP. And therefore, it can destroy much deeper into the critical infrastructures. It can directly knock out automobiles, for example. The natural EMP won't. The car would still run after a geomagnetic superstorm, as long as you've got gas in it. But a nuclear EMP, E1 from a nuclear EMP, will stop your power, destroy radios, televisions, personal computers, small electronics, as well as the large electronics like extra high voltage transformers, which are the cornerstone of our electronic civilization. And it's indispensable to our civilization as roads and aqueducts were to the Romans. Now the rings on this view graph depict the scope of the EMP field, the radius of the EMP field, and the altitude. You'll see in the center, at 30 kilometers altitude, you get an EMP field that's the size of several states. But the EMP will cause damage well beyond the radius of that field. Because what it would do is destroy all kinds of electronics, SCADAs, transformers, other kinds of electronics that are within the footprint that is depicted, that inner ring, at an altitude of 30 kilometers. But the damage wouldn't be limited to that. It would cause cascading failures far beyond and end up collapsing at least the eastern grid, perhaps the grid in the entire country. But all they have to do is really take out the eastern grid. That's where 75% of U.S. electricity is generated, and most of our population depends upon it. Notice that you get that field at an altitude of 30 kilometers. You don't even need a missile to get a nuclear weapon up 30 kilometers. You could use a meteorological or a private jet could be zoom climbed up to that altitude. So that's a very easy one for the adversary to execute in terms of achieving altitude. The outer rings, the ones that are labeled 400 kilometers and 300 kilometers, those are the altitudes at which you would detonate to get a footprint like that. So if you detonated a weapon at 300 kilometers, 400 kilometers altitude over the center of the United States, the footprint would cover all 48 contiguous United States, most of Canada, and most of Mexico, and destroy electronics within the area of that footprint. This could be achieved by a satellite, such as North Korea has got orbiting over us right now. North Korea has two satellites, the KSM-2 and KSM-3, orbiting over the United States at the optimum altitude and trajectory to evade national missile defenses, put an EMP field, just like those outer rings, over the United States. It could be done with a freighter, missile launched off a freighter, like a Shahab-3 medium-range missile. The Iranians have practiced launching missiles off freighters. They've also practiced using the Shahab-3, fusing it, not doing a nuclear detonation, but doing fusing at high altitudes, consistent with the EMP attack. Dr. Graham, who was the chairman of the EMP Commission, said to Congress that he could think of no other explanation except that the Iranians were practicing using the Shahab for a nuclear EMP attack. And the Shahab would be perfect missile because you could put it in its mobile, so you could roll it into a freighter, sail it into the Gulf of Mexico, and achieve the altitude, achieve that kind of an attack that would put an EMP field down, such as it's depicted. Next view graph. Now the third kind of EMP threat is non-nuclear. You don't need a nuclear weapon to make an EMP attack. There are radio frequency weapons that basically will make a field like that. A high frequency EMP field called E1 EMP that I was describing before. It's usually not as powerful as a nuclear EMP field, and it's certainly not as extensive. The radius of a radio frequency weapon could be measured usually at hundreds of yards, not in thousands of kilometers. But you could destroy the whole country using several of these devices. The U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission estimated that if just 9 of the 2,000 known extra high voltage transformer substations were destroyed, it would start cascading effects that would roll the whole grid, cause a nationwide blackout lasting 18 months. 18 months with no nuclear weapon, with no geomagnetic superstorm. In fact, that could be achieved. You don't even need a really great, it could be achieved with rocket-propelled grenade launchers or high-powered rifles if you knew which 9 transformers to attack out of the 2,000. And why is that? The reason for that is, as I mentioned earlier, the electric grid is constantly operating on the verge of failure. And so, when you take out a transformer, a big transformer, these transformers are typically carrying hundreds of thousands of volts of electricity. And when you destroy one, the voltage has to go somewhere, and it gets dumped on the neighboring transformers, and it's just too much for them to handle. And so, by knocking out those first 9 dominoes, it causes the neighboring transformers to go into failure. So you have this cascading, rolling blackout, a permanent blackout that would sweep across the whole country. Something like this happened back during the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003. Fortunately, it wasn't a permanent, protracted blackout, because it didn't start with destroying EHV transformers. But a tree branch basically made contact with a high voltage power line in the state of Ohio. So this is just a very small single point failure. But it kept, because the grid was the summer, the grid was operating on the verge of failure, it started a cascading series of events that resulted in a blackout of the whole northeastern United States, put 50 million people in the dark. Just from a tree branch coming in contact with a high voltage power line. That's how sensitive it is. So you can just imagine that if you had, a coordinated, well-planned attack by non-nuclear radio frequency weapons, or a nuclear EMP attack, or combining them all, which is what the bad guys plan to do, as we shall talk about later, a new way of warfare, called hybrid warfare, or I call blackout wars. They have various names, right? We call it total information warfare. The Russians call it no contact war. But the idea is a new way of warfare that you combine nuclear EMP, non-nuclear EMP, and cyber attacks and physical sabotage. Any one of these effects could potentially take down the grid. But all of them together become irresistible. And this is how they plan to take us down. The Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, all the plans. To complete my comments on this phase, not only can you build non-nuclear radio frequency weapons using design information off the internet and using parts that can be purchased from an electronics store. We actually did an experiment in Congress when I was on the House Armed Services Committee, where we hired a guy with a master's degree in electrical engineering and gave him a few students to work with, gave him a little bit of money in a year, and told him, go see if you can build a radio frequency weapon using unclassified design information and parts purchased just from Radio Shack. And at the end of the year, he came up with 2 working radio frequency weapons. One of them was designed to fit in a Volkswagen bus. The idea was you drive it down Wall Street, black out the Wall Street computers, cause a nationwide economic crisis. The other one was designed to fit inside a box for a Xerox machine. This was before 9/11, before the Pentagon ended up putting in place more secure measures. Well, back in those days, you could mail this Xerox box to the Pentagon mail room, and it would just sit there for weeks. If you put the wrong address on it, the wrong room, and they wouldn't know where to send it, it would just sit in the mail room. The idea was burn out computers in the Pentagon. But you don't need to build a radio frequency weapon either. What you're looking at is actually an advertisement in a U.S. magazine for selling this device called an EMP SUITCASE. It's not intended to be used as a weapon. It's intended to be used as a diagnostic tool by industries, so that if you have big electronic equipment planning a factory floor with heavy electronics in it, before you bring in those electronics, you can figure out how far apart they have to be spaced, or how big the barriers have to be, so that the electronic equipment doesn't burn each other out and fratricide, because big electronics put out electromagnetic transients, EMPs as it were, so they can destroy each other. This device is intended, is for peaceful uses. Plan your factory floor when you're using electronic equipment. But it could be used just like a weapon. if it's a terrorist or a criminal or a madman, we've arrived at a place where technology has become so advanced that somebody got their hands on this weapon, on this device. They could use it as put it in the trunk of their car, drive the car to an EHV transformer substation. So when individual, could topple the technological pillars of civilization for a major metropolitan area. And if you had a team of individuals, 9 ISIS operatives with cars, with devices like this, they knew which transformer substations to go to. They could take out the whole country, kill 90% of our population in 12 months. So that's where we are. And you don't even need a license to buy this. This basically can be used as a weapon of mass destruction, deadlier than the Hiroshima or Nagasaki bombs. And you don't even need a license to buy it. Next view. Now, these threats are not just theoretical, but they're real, and we've actually experienced them. The threats are flying right over our heads, as I had mentioned earlier. This is a photograph of Kim Jong-un, the dictator of North Korea, taken in April 2013, when he was making threats to make nuclear missile strikes against the United States. It was in the aftermath of his 3rd illegal nuclear test. And to take revenge upon the United States for asking the United Nations to impose additional sanctions on North Korea, he started threatening to make nuclear missile strikes against the U.S. And in the midst of this worst ever crisis with North Korea is when the KSM-2 was orbited over us. And we're very concerned about North Korea. We should be much more concerned than the administration and press is, because the EMP Commission has compelling evidence that North Korea has got this super EMP weapon. The design information was probably leaked from Russia. In fact, it certainly was. We were approached by 2 Russian generals, top experts in EMP, who warned the commission. This was unprecedented. Russians almost never take responsibility for the leakage of technology. But they said there were Russian scientists working in North Korea. There had been brain drain, and by accident, these Russian nuclear weapon designers had managed to go to work for North Korea. And so North Korea had the super EMP weapon, and they anticipated. This was in the summer of 2004. I was actually present at the meeting, the commission, when they told us this, that within a few years, we could expect North Korea to test a super EMP nuclear weapon. And then right on cue, a few years later, after that meeting in 2006, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test, which was widely kind of ridiculed by a lot of people in the world, so-called experts, because it was a very low yield. A lot of people thought the test had failed because it was only 1 to 3 kilotons. That's only 10% to 30% of the yield of the 10 kiloton Hiroshima bomb. Most non-experts think that the first nuclear device is going to be a fission bomb like a Hiroshima bomb, and it should have a 10 kiloton yield. But not if it's a super EMP weapon, because these are not designed for producing a big explosive field. Their energy is converted to gamma radiation. So it's you get a very low yield. In fact, it's exactly the kind of yield that all 4 North Korean devices produce, under 10 kilotons, neighborhood of 1 to 3 kilotons. The seismic signal, looked very much like a super, with this fizzle, the gamma rays coming out. Next, you grab. In the midst of this nuclear crisis, when North Korea, on an almost daily basis, was threatening to make nuclear missile strikes against the United States, President Obama was telling the American people not to worry, because North Korea hadn't miniaturized nuclear weapons yet. It didn't have the capability to reach the United States. On the very day, this was April 16th, that he said this. On the very day that President Obama was telling this to the New York Times, the North Korean KSM-2 satellite orbited right over his head. You can see the tracks of the KSM-2 back in 2013 here, and the number 16 shows where the track of the KSM-2 North Korean satellite was on April 16th. It passed right over Washington, D.C., New York City port. Another thing that happened on that day, so basically the Obama administration has been lying to the American people for years about the idea that North Korea doesn't have intercontinental reach, and that it cannot threaten the United States. Not only can it reach the United States with these satellites, which are still in orbit, the KSM-2 continues to follow this track. And this February, the threat is unfolding so fast that I haven't had time to update my briefing to include all the new threats that are coming up. But we've had a new nuclear crisis, as you know, as a result of the most recent fourth illegal North Korean nuclear test in January of this year. And in February, they launched another satellite called the KSM-3, which is also passing over the United States. What it does is it goes over the South Pole and approaches us from the south. We have no ballistic missile early warning radios, no interceptor spaces. Our national missile defenses were designed to deal with threats in the Cold War. We expected the Russians, the Chinese, or the North Koreans to attack us coming over the North Pole. But instead, it comes up from the south. This, by the way, is based on another secret weapon the Soviet Union had developed during the Cold War that I have no doubt has been shared with the North Koreans by the Russians, accidentally, supposedly. It was called the Fractional Orbital Bombardment System. During the Cold War, the Soviets planned to do exactly this. They would launch a missile, they would pretend they were launching a peaceful satellite, launch it to the south, pass over the South Pole, because they knew we had no ballistic missile early warning radios facing the south, and no interceptors facing the south. Then when it got over the center of the United States, they would detonate the warhead and basically surprise us with an EMP attack. It would paralyze our command and control, paralyze our nuclear forces, prevent us from retaliating. And then it would be followed by a massive attack over the North Pole by their ICBMs, their bombers, and some launch ballistic missiles to destroy our missiles in their silos, or bombers on their bases, ballistic missile submarines in their pens, and destroy our communications beams to talk to the submarines at sea, to neutralize our sea-based nuclear. Now the North Korean idea, is to rely just on the EMP part of that attack. They don't have the massive, the large numbers of weapons necessary. Although we don't need that many weapons these days. We've so drawn down our nuclear forces. Most people don't realize it. We've only got 3 bomber bases. Even North Korea can take out all of our strategic bombers with just 3 warheads. We've got 2 submarine bases. They could take those out too. They've got enough ICBMs right now to do that. Now they can't take out the 500 Minuteman ICBMs. The North Koreans can, but the Russians can. Maybe the Chinese can too. But the North Korean plan, insofar as it looks right now, is to pose this constant threat to us with these satellites already overhead. It's really all they need to destroy us is one of these satellites to go off and do an EMP, take down the electric grid for a protracted period of time. It would basically eliminate our civilization. On April 16th, while the satellite was passing over President Obama's head, while he was telling us that North Korea can't threaten us with long-range missiles yet, a mysterious event happened on the west coast of the United States on that very day. It was a mysterious attack by parties unknown on the Metcalf Transformer substation in San Jose, California, which services Silicon Valley. They used AK-47s, which is the favorite sidearm of terrorists in rogue states. The U.S. Navy SEALs investigated this at the behest of the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And they concluded that it was a professional job, it was the kind of thing that SEALs would do, it was so well planned and organized. They knew how to get into an underground tunnel and cut fiber optic cables that would provide warning to the police and fire so they could isolate this transformer substation. They didn't just spray the transformers, it was aimed fire. But they also knew just how far they could go without actually destroying the transformers. They apparently didn't want to actually destroy the transformers. They wanted to just see whether they could get away with it, which is what an exercise, a training mission is all about. Anyone who's been in the military knows, for example, especially if you're doing a nuclear forces exercise, you don't actually make a nuclear war on the enemy or a conventional war on the enemy. You're just practicing to see, how effectively can you pull off your operation. And you don't want to alarm the enemy by actually doing damage so that he will then have early warning and take measures to protect himself. That's what the Navy SEALs concluded, that this was a training mission, not an actual attempt to take down the grid yet, but practice for taking down the grid at some future date. And it fits right into this new way of warfare that the the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans have developed, which combines EMP attack with physical sabotage, that would be the attack on the Metcalf Transformer substation, with cyber attacks, which were happening all the time, all through this scenario back in 2013. Next view, Brad. This is what the detonation from a weapon launched off a freighter might look like if you just wanted to take off the East Coast. Next view, Brad. I'm going to rush through some of these because we don't have that much time. This shows the HV transformers and the generator substations in the United States. Notice that in the eastern grid, the United States grid is divided into an eastern grid, a western grid, and a Texas grid. You in Texas have your own grid. And 75% of U.S. power is generated in the eastern grid. Those are the substations, generators that are all in red. Those are the ones that would have been covered by that EMP field that was depicted in the previous view graph. An EMP field like that can be caused by an Iranian Shahab 3 launched off a freighter, for example. And that's all you really have to do. You don't even have to attack the whole United States. If you just took out that half of the United States, the part in red, that would destroy our country. 75% of our electricity gone. We can't survive as a nation with such a loss of electricity. Next view, Brad. The nightmare scenario for the EMP Commission was this scenario I've talked about, referenced several times, the idea of launching a missile off of a freighter. It's called a scud in a tub scenario, by some people. We've actually seen the Iranians practice this. You could use a scud missile, it's a short-range missile, to loft a warhead over the eastern grid or over Texas, and take out the grid by that means. The beauty of this is that it keeps your fingerprints off the attack. Instead of using a long-range missile that originates in your country, it can be done from U.S. coastal waters, camouflaged by the thousands of freighters that are operating on a day-to-day basis in our coastal waters. We would have no idea who originated that attack. And because the warhead detonates at high altitude, it leaves no forensic evidence, unlike a nuclear weapon. A lot of people will say, well, if you had a nuclear weapon, why would you waste it on an EMP attack? There have been people who don't understand nuclear weapons and strategy very well, who have actually argued that. Say, oh, surely terrorists would prefer to take that nuclear weapon and detonate it in a city. Well, it's actually riskier to try to get a nuclear weapon into a city than it is to launch it off a freighter. All kinds of things can go wrong if you have a small terrorist team trying to smuggle a nuclear weapon into the city. As soon as you, for one thing, just trusting your own people. When you're dealing with these totalitarian regimes, that's a real big concern. The leaders of these totalitarian regimes are extremely paranoid. They don't have the kind of trust in their troops that we have in the Green Berets. These people, terrorists, special forces operating from North Korea or Iran, they're not the Green Berets. They're coming out of oppressive regimes where families have suffered. If you're one of the Ayatollahs, or if you're Kim Jong-un, how do you know if you've given a precious nuclear weapon to one of your commando teams, that these guys, or one of them, when they get in the boundaries of the United States, is going to call the CIA or the FBI and say, I've got a North Korean nuclear weapon. Do you have $1 million? It's a very plausible scenario. The last thing you want to do is lose the nuclear weapon and be discovered. Also, if you did succeed in smuggling the weapon into a city and detonated it there, the most you'd kill is a couple 100,000 people from the blast and fallout events. Whereas if you use that same nuclear weapon launched off a freighter by a Scud missile or a Shahab 3, you've got the option. You've got a real good shot at killing 90% of the American people, eliminating the United States as world power, and winning the war. It's really the only option where you can use one or a few nuclear weapons to actually win a war with the United States. Detonating a bomb in a city also leaves massive amounts of forensic evidence. It's perfect for us. You know, the bomb debris gets trapped in concrete and glass and steel, and gives us a really good chance of figuring out whose bomb was this, so that we can then go and turn that country into a plate of glass for their own nuclear forces. So blowing up one U.S. city, or even a few U.S. cities with nuclear weapons, won't win the war, and is guaranteed to get you eliminated. Whereas if you did an EMP attack, off a freighter, or even by satellite, it can keep your fingerprints off the attack so that we would know who did it. And that's basically the essence of deterrence. You must know who made the attack so that you can retaliate. If the bad guys have confidence that they can get away with this without retaliation, then it greatly increases the chances that they'll actually do it. Next speaker. And in 2013, the North Koreans appeared to have practiced this very scenario, the scud-in-a-bucket scenario. The Chong gang was a North Korean freighter a couple of months, it was July, a few months after the big nuclear crisis in 2013, when Kim Jong-un was making all these threats against us, these nuclear threats. This freighter entered the Gulf of Mexico from the Atlantic side, and steamed across the Atlantic so that it was in the optimal position where they could, if they wanted to, they could have come in close to shore and done a launch. And then they tried to return to North Korea through the Panama Canal. Now it happens that this freighter was notorious for trying to smuggle drugs and small arms to terrorist organizations and criminal groups. So it was on the watch list. The Panamanian authorities were looking for drugs. But they found hidden under thousands of bags of sugar in the hold of this freighter 2 SA-2 nuclear-capable missiles mounted on their launchers. Now the missiles didn't have warheads. Again, this was an exercise, probably. They were practicing to see if they could get away with it. And it almost seems like the North Koreans said to themselves, well, here, we've actually gotten into the Gulf of Mexico with 2 nuclear-capable missiles on their launchers. All we would have to do is take the bags of sugar out, and we could launch these to take out the United States if we had nuclear warheads on these missiles. Just how dumb are the Americans? Can we actually, let's see if we can get through the Panama Canal and reduce the transit time. And fortunately, we caught them there. But had they not tried getting to the Panama Canal, we would never even have known about this. Now, we arrested the captain and the crew and held the freighter, and Panama has got these 2 missiles, so they can go back to North Korea. But you see, this stuff is not just theoretical possibilities. Our adversaries are actually not only writing about this in the military doctrine, they've actually practiced coming to our shores with the capabilities, exercising the capabilities, flying satellites over our heads, conducting cyber attacks, apparently conducting physical sabotage, with troops putting their boots on the ground in America to try to practice attacking our electorate. Which is this new way of warfare. It's a new way of warfare because you don't want to have to take on the Marines, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force. They always lose when they have to confront our military forces. But this is attacking our technological Achilles heel. And if you destroy our electorate and the critical infrastructures that support our military, then the military is defeated too. Next speaker. Again, I've been talking about how this isn't just theoretical, but it's real. In October 27th, 2013, there was a National Geographic documentary that ran that day, that Sunday. I believe it was called American Blackout. Yes, National Geographic documentary called American Blackout. And it speculated about a cyber attack causing a 10-day blackout in the United States and what would happen. And the electric power industry was outraged and said, oh, nothing like this could ever happen in the United States. You're trying to raise hysteria, scare people. And they were so ignorant. This is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. And the electric power industry were so ignorant of the real threat that they were unaware that that very morning, on October 27th, the Knights Templars, which is a terrorist drug cartel in Mexico, had actually used physical sabotage to black out a big chunk of the Mexican electric grid. They put about 500,000 people in it, so they could go into towns and villages and execute people opposed to the drug trade. The federales weren't able to come to the rescue because of the blackout. Now, when Neanderthals, like the Knights Templars, have figured out that the electric grid is a major societal vulnerability, what does ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Iran, North Korea, China, Russia got in store for us? Next view, Graham. On June 9th, 2014, when we were focused on ISIS engaging in its startling conquest of Syria and northern Iraq, all the attention was focused there, and very little press attention was given to the fact that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula blacked out the entire nation of Yemen with physical attacks. It wasn't a protracted blackout, it was a temporary blackout. But it was the first time in history the whole nation has been blacked out by a terrorist attack. And it was enough to destabilize the Yemeni government, so it fell a few months later to the Houthis that are an ally of Iran. So blackout wars, this war that goes after the electric grid and other critical infrastructures, actually been used successfully already against a U.S. ally. And it has had significant geostrategic consequences because Yemen, a nation of 18 cities and 24 million people was put into blackout, was a very important ally in the Middle East. Now it's not. It's switched sides in the war on terrorism, basically been taken over by Iran. The blackout war. Next view, Brad. That's a picture of one of the high power lines that was knocked out by the Houthis in Iran that caused the blackout. Next view, Brad. On January 25th, 2015, terrorists blacked out 80% of the Pakistan grid. Again, it was a temporary blackout. They used physical sabotage to do it. Nobody knows why they did it. Maybe it was practice for a more ambitious operation. But don't forget that Pakistan is a nuclear weapons state. It's a nuclear weapons state. Is it possible that the terrorists were practicing nationwide blackout because the Taliban have designs on getting their hands on a Pakistani bomb and maybe a missile? Next view, Brad. Most of Turkey was blacked out, reportedly by an Iranian cyber attack on March 31st, 2015. Now, Turkey later denied that it was a cyber attack from Iran, but it's possible, it's likely that that denial was because their denial happened shortly after they shot down a Russian jet that had violated their territory. And the Russians moved several thousand troops to the Turkish border in retaliation for that, and were threatening retaliation against Turkey. So, the Turks up to that point had basically been saying that, yeah, this had been an Iranian cyber attack that caused the blackout. But their quick reversal of that seems to me, to others, probably they didn't want to give the Russians a clue about, hey, come after us with a cyber attack, because they were so vulnerable to it. The Iranians had done it successfully. The Russians are even better at cyber attacks than the Iranians. So Turkey probably deserves to remain on the hit list for victims of cyber warfare that attack electric grids. Next view, Brad. And Ukraine, Western Ukraine, was blacked out temporarily on a temporary basis by a cyber attack from Russia. So, where are we? So we've had several attacks on electric grids by cyber, by physical sabotage, simulated nuclear attacks against the United States itself. Where I think we are is, it's like 1936, 1937, 1938. When you may recall, those of you who know history a little bit, before World War II, the Western elites, guys like Neville Chamberlain, 99% of the Western elites, didn't believe there could be a World War II. And they ignored guys like Winston Churchill, who were warning that you've got to understand the doctrine of the Nazis. The Nazis are not a normal nation state. Their ideology matters. The way they think matters. They really mean what they're saying. This isn't just propaganda that they're putting out for the consumption of their own people to stay in power. That ideology matters, and that Hitler will act on that ideology, and we will have another world war. Moreover, Churchill and guys like General J.F.C. Fuller and Churchillian colleagues, just a handful of these backbenchers, were trying to warn that the Nazis had developed a new way of war called the Blitzkrieg. It was completely unlike World War I. This new idea was going to combine armor, massive armor divisions, fast-moving infantry and fast-moving artillery, and air power. It was going to be a war of movement and speed, unlike the trench warfare of World War I. And they would use maneuver and speed and concentrated firepower to defeat the obsolete armies of the Western democracies in no time. And ignoring that threat from the Blitzkrieg was putting Western civilization at risk. And what the Nazis did is they experimented with the Blitzkrieg in a low-profile way. In 1938, for example, during the Spanish Civil War, did small-scale Blitzkrieg operations there, did exercises, even in Russia and in Germany. And just to see, make sure that the pieces and the combined whole of the Blitzkrieg would work before they unleashed it on the Western democracies. And they nearly conquered us. They nearly defeated the Western democracies. The only way we stopped them was by coming up with a better Blitzkrieg. In the deserts of North Africa, where we lost thousands of men, the Russians lost 30 million people in World War II, learning how to fight a better Blitzkrieg. Well, we can't afford to be caught by surprise like that again. History won't be so forgiving next time. This new way of warfare will not unfold in weeks the way the Blitzkrieg did. It will unfold in hours. And there'll be no coming back from that if we're not prepared. Next view, Brad. That's what I think the bad guys are doing in Ukraine and Yemen, Turkey, Pakistan. They're like the Nazis, they're experimenting with this new way of warfare at a small scale before they unleash it on the West. Now let's, this view, Grant, revolutions in military affairs. I want to take you, let's try to think like the adversary, like the Russians, for just a minute. It's so important to understand how your adversary thinks about the world and about future war. And we almost never do it, even though a lot of lip service is paid to that. But here I want to talk to you briefly, hopefully I can be brief, about this new military doctrine and how it evolved on the Russian side. Here are the main points of a Russian military textbook that was taught at the General Staff Academy. It's General P.A. Zhilin's The History of Military Art. And this was taught in the General Staff Academy during the Cold War and is still taught in the General Staff Academy today. And I think it's extremely revealing about how the Russian General Staff thinks about history. And basically the way they see history is unfolding as a series of what they call revolutions in military affairs, where the introduction of a new technology, new tactics, enables one civilization to replace another one. And so in Zhilin's The History of Military Art, he starts with the agricultural civilizations of ancient Egypt, the Hittites, that were able to overcome the nation states because these first agricultural empires could put more men in the field, could put more organized armies in the field, could put expensive chariots, trained charioteers, military specialists in the field. So they were able to build big empires and swallow up the nation states at the time. Those civilizations, the Egyptian and Hittite civilizations, and eventually the Persians displaced the city-states of the ancient world. Then the Persian Empire falls to Alexander the Great and Greek civilization that has a new way of warfare from the Macedonian phalanx, that combines basically a 16-foot-long spear that can reach longer than the 8-foot spears used by other armies. New tactics employ in this Macedonian phalanx that combines it with cavalry, and it enables them to conquer the Persian Empire, and it brings on the age of Hellenism, where Greek civilization becomes dominant in the Mediterranean world. Hellenism, in turn, its turn, is conquered by the Roman Empire, which has the technologies of roads, aqueducts, which enable them to have a bigger population, field armies that also have new tactics, first artillery trains like ballistas and scorpions, and So they conquer the Greeks. You have the Romans dominating Western civilization. Next, you grab. You know, Rome falls to the barbarians, and you have the rise of feudal Europe with its mounted knights, semi-autonomous baronies, which is shattered by the invention of gunpowder, artillery, and the longbow. Kingdoms are eclipsed by early nation-states, rising nationalism in the early Industrial Revolution that invents mass citizen armies of the Napoleonic era and total war. World War I is the first scientific total war, which harnesses the machine gun, poison gas, and industrial mass production to slaughter million-man armies, destroying the old world order dominated by Western Europe. Nazi Germany nearly wins World War II, the Blitzkrieg, but is defeated by the USSR's scientific socialism that supposedly enables the Soviets to outproduce and outfight the Nazis with a better Blitzkrieg. Remember, this is a Soviet military era textbook, so they see themselves as being the victors in World War II, and they see themselves in Gielin's History of Military Art as being the victors in the Cold War. You know, they anticipated that the nuclear missile age was the new technology, the invention of nuclear weapons that would enable them to replace Western civilization, with communism, and that they would win the inevitable nuclear war with the West. There's a reason Gielin called his book A History of Military Art, because they believed in scientific socialism. The idea was that man is a machine, and that a new science of sociology, communist understanding of mankind, would enable you to replace the military art of the past, which was basically intuitive, not scientifically based, with a new, truly scientific understanding of human nature, military tactics, of a superior way of organizing society that would be based on a scientific understanding of mankind, and not the mythical ideas of a spiritual man and the like that dominated the past. Fortunately, they ended up being wrong. It was the Soviet Union that ended up on the ash heap of history. And so we have proven, Ronald Reagan proved with the victory of the Cold War, the West doesn't, and as we proved against Nazi Germany, that if we're smart, if we're prepared, if we outthink the enemy, we can win. That's what we did in World War II. That's what we did in the Cold War. Stellar victory in the Cold War. First time in history, we managed to bring down a great empire, the evil empire that was the Soviet Union, probably the greatest, strongest totalitarian empire that ever existed. We did it peacefully. Next view, Brent. Now, the next book that supplements Gielin's The History of Military Art, the Russian General Staff, is General Vladimir Slivchenko's New Revolution in Military Affairs, called Contact Corps, which describes this new way of warfare that I've been talking about all through this briefing, where you can achieve the most decisive revolution in military affairs in history, so that one civilization can replace another, not by attacking the other guy's military forces, but by attacking its electric grids, the civilian critical infrastructure, the technological Achilles heel of the society. You don't need big massed armies. It's not a war of armies and navies and air forces. It's a war where you use EMP weapons, cyber weapons, small, well-trained commando groups to strike, at those 9 key transformer substations, for example, to bring civilization to its knees. This is the most revolutionary war strategy in history, the most revolutionaries in military affairs in their view. And I think in reality, because for the first time in history, you don't need to be a great power to defeat the greatest powers on earth. Even a failed state like Iran and North Korea can do this. All they need is one nuclear weapon. They could even conceivably do it without a nuclear weapon, just with commandos, if they know where to attack. But if you combine nuclear, cyber, physical sabotage, the effects of the attack become irresistible. You're combining several deadly attacks, any one of which could work. And there's a military equation called Lancaster's square, so that when you combine things like that, the effectiveness is not just threefold, but it's n squared, so it's like 9-fold effectiveness. Now someone is trying to call me on my phone, so maybe I'll text message. Sorry. So we've arrived at a place with this new revolutionary military affairs where failed states like North Korea or Iran, or even subnational actors like terrorist groups, to defeat the most successful and powerful nations on earth. Just gonna put on my glasses to check the time. Yes. Next view, Brad. I'm going to skip through these so that we'll have time for our questions. But here are some additional quotations from, this is, for example, from Wen Shui Gang's World War, Third World War, Total Information Warfare. It's a textbook for the People's Liberation Army. And it basically says the same thing that Vladimir Slivchenko's, General Slivchenko's No Contact Wars says. And that describes this idea of using nuclear EMP attack as cyber, that they're basically the same thing. That this is total information warfare would include nuclear EMP attack with cyber, and that this is the decisive way of war. The Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans have borrowed from the Russians and are copying the Russians on this new way of warfare. The Russians seem to be the inspiration for the model they follow for their new way of war. Next view, Brad. Iranian military doctrine also reflects this, and talks about how the use of nuclear weapons, can be is decisive in war, combined with cyber attacks, combined with physical sabotage. This is from quotes from one of their military journals from an Iranian military defense. Mind you, it was written back in 2010, and note that here this military textbook is officially endorsing using nuclear weapons for the EMP attack. And as the EMP Commission warned, the Iranians have actually practiced this with Shahab-3 missiles. They've also launched satellites on the same trajectory that the North Koreans have, practicing the EMP attacks apparently by satellite. And the Obama administration doesn't like to discuss it, but North Korea and Iran are allies by treaty. And there are North Korean technicians physically present in Iran, helping them on their so-called space program, probably on their nuclear program as well. It's a great concern, but my colleagues and myself, this claim that the administration has that this Iran nuclear deal has stopped Iran from getting the bomb. I personally don't believe that at all. I have written articles and co-authored them. Senior members, former senior advisors, President Reagan and National Security Advisor, and the Clinton administration as well, and Jim Wilson, who was the former director of the CIA, Chris Ehrmark, who was the chairman of the National Intelligence Council, Pat Cooper, ambassador, who was the director of the Strategic Defense Initiative, Dr. William Graham, who was President Reagan's science advisor, director of NASA, chairman of the current Congressional EMP Commission, and the past EMP Commission. All of us have written articles which haven't gotten much publicity, but we have concluded that the evidence is pretty compelling that Iran already has the bomb, that they've actually had the bomb for quite some time, and probably since at least 2003. When you look at the IAEA reports, you look at the kinds of technologies that the Iranians already had back in 2003, it's pretty hard to believe that they don't have the bomb. Don't forget, it only took the United States 3 years during the Manhattan Project to build 2 atomic bombs of radically different design, both of which work perfectly. Iran supposedly has been crashing on nuclear weapons. They've had their own Manhattan Project for almost 30 years. Supposedly they still don't have the bomb. We know that before 2003, they were doing things like making neutron initiators, bridge wire detonators, which are essential components. They're components for nuclear weapons. And when the United States was making neutron initiators, bridge wire detonators during the Manhattan Project, we were only 6 months in being able to build them. They were building these things, 13 years ago, back before 2003. So we think Iran might already have the bomb, the capability to do an EMP attack, but they've been keeping a lower profile with North Korea. We also think they've been following the example of North Korea with the agreed framework with Bill Clinton. You may recall that President Clinton promised that this agreed framework was going to keep Iran from getting the bomb, becoming a nuclear weapons state. That didn't work out. Now where we are, North Korea is in fact a nuclear missile state, despite Bill Clinton's agreed framework.
Dr. Pry.
Next to you, Brad.
Dr. Pry, if we could begin to wrap this up, we have a couple of questions for you.
Okay, well let me just skip to the last few, Brad. Go to the last few, Brad, before we want to show people. Summing this all up, I apologize for taking so long. I have no clock in front of me to time myself. But this is in effect what we're talking about in terms of the threat. What I call a blackout war, what the Chinese call total information warfare, what the Russians call sixth generation warfare. Attacking a grid, this revolution in military affairs can start with a natural phenomenon like a hurricane or a heat wave, something that puts natural stress on the grid. Then you have cyber attacks combined with physical attacks like sabotage, non-nuclear radio frequency weapons, and then the most powerful weapon of all, a nuclear EMP attack, that single weapon detonated at high altitude. By this means, they would envision overturning our civilization and defeating us in just 24 hours. So that's the threat. That's what I hope Texas will help us take an important step toward countering by not waiting for Washington and protecting the Texas grid. It can be done. We know how to do it. It doesn't cost much. All that is missing is political will. And that political will right now is not coming from Washington. So thank you for having patience in hearing me out. I'm sorry for prattling on at such great length. But let's go to your questions.
Well, we apologize initially because we're going to have some feedback here, but that's okay. We'll work through that. I wanted to ask you, you talked a little bit about the cost or the kinds of things. Can you briefly summarize what's some of those things that can be done by local power companies, not necessarily government officials, but give us some of the practical kinds of things and any estimates that have been done from a cost standpoint. We know what the cost would be of losing our civilization, but any idea that your commission look at any of those kinds of things?
Of course, we actually came up with a plan for protecting the national electric grid. And the cost of that plan would have been $2 billion. We give away $2 billion every year in foreign aid to Pakistan. I don't even know why we give foreign aid to Pakistan, since it's a nuclear weapons state, fundamentally hostile to the United States, what we do. If we suspended foreign aid to Pakistan for 1 year and spent it on the security of the American people, it would go a long way toward protecting the whole United States. Now, what the costs are, it depends. You can spend less money and buy less security, or you can spend more money, a lot more money, and buy a lot more security. I'm always in favor of buying more security. There are more expensive plans that would spend up to $20 billion, that would provide even more security than what the EMP Commission came up with. But the EMP Commission plan is a good, solid plan. It would protect like all 2,000 extra high voltage transformers, all the key control centers, the generators, in the electric grid. The object of the Commission plan would be to transform a civilization-ending catastrophe into a manageable disaster so that we can bring the grid back, the other critical infrastructures back, before we had mass starvation. Now, there are more expensive plans that would so protect the grid and other critical infrastructures so that you basically wouldn't even have to worry about EMP attack anymore. Someone could try attacking you and it would be like water off a duck's back. So it depends how much security you want to buy. When someone asks me how much would it cost to protect the grid, it's sort of like asking, well, how much will it cost to protect your house against a fire? If you start off with zero protection in your house, you're at very high risk that if there's a fire, your whole family will perish from a fire. But if you just spend $20 or $15 to put a smoke detector in the house, immediately it greatly increases your security. You can further increase your security by investing in fire extinguishers in the kitchen and places where fire, or put up even more money and put a sprinkler system in the house so that if there's a fire, you won't even lose your house. So it depends how much security you want to buy. But I think $2 billion is a good, solid plan for the electric grid. That's the national electric grid. And how does that work? Well, same kinds of technologies that the military has used for 50 years. Surge arresters, Faraday cages, blocking devices. A surge arrestor is basically a switch that you put on an EHV transformer or on a SCADA, and when it senses an EMP coming in on the line, you know, it decouples the switch so that the pulse can't flow through into the transformer. You have surge arresters on a personal computer at home. If you look at the end of the plug that goes into the wall, you'll see that the plug is fat. There's usually a little small black plastic box on that plug. You've basically got a surge arrestor on your personal computer so that if there's a lightning strike on the line, it interferes with that EMP. That's called E2 EMP, that lightning. And it stops the lightning from damaging your personal computer. Now that surge arrestor isn't good enough to protect against the nuclear EMP, the E1 EMP, the E3 EMP from the sun. The idea is that we would have bigger, more robust surge arresters, similar fundamental in terms of basic physical principles that would work in much the same way as the surge arrestor that protects your personal computer. But you'd install these things on the transformers and SCADA systems. So that's how it would work for Texas. You know, the cost, again, it depends upon how much security you want to buy, whether you've got a good plan. Don't get me wrong, if you've got a bad plan, you can spend a lot of money and not be successful in protecting the grid. You need a good plan. You know, but if you had a good plan, Texas could be protected for much less than $2 billion. I mean, that's what it would cost to protect the, you know, the whole United States.
Thank you. Anyone, if you have a question, feel free to come on up, look at it with solutions, and I know you'll be a part of that discussion. And we certainly want to say thank you for taking the time out of your holiday to come join us tonight. On behalf of all of us, let's please give a round of applause.
Solution. And I do hope you move forward in supporting Senator Hall in Texas. You know, this is a clear and present danger. You know, the threat from the sun is inevitable, and the threat from Iran and North Korea, I would not be surprised waking up tomorrow morning and we suddenly found the lights were out. You know, we are truly running out of time to protect our nation.
Thank you, Doctor. Have a great holiday, and thanks again, and safe travels. We'll be in touch some more, I'm sure, as we continue this battle. Have a great evening with your family, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye now.